Life had settled into a quiet, repetitive rhythm that no longer surprised me, as if each day was simply a softer version of the one before it. I would wake up without urgency, moving through familiar corners of my antique shop, surrounded by objects holding more history than my own life. Dusting shelves that rarely changed, rearranging items that hardly sold. I convinced myself staying busy kept loneliness from becoming too loud. In truth, loneliness lingered like a constant hum. Even closing the shop in evenings, walking empty streets toward home, it stayed. I carried that silence, an emotional weight so familiar I almost mistook it for peace. Especially after Dan left 7 years ago. The life I thought was permanent simply split into before and after without warning, leaving me in a world where memories felt like someone else's. Though I told myself I had adjusted, accepted being alone at 57, truth slipped through cracks in small, ordinary moments. Like standing in grocery aisles surrounded by strangers who all seemed to belong somewhere except me. And it was on one of those days everything shifted. I had gone to Walmart expecting nothing more than routine errands, pushing my cart slowly past shelves stacked with colorful boxes. My mind drifting as I selected items out of habit rather than interest, until I reached the checkout area where I first saw him. Hunter, though I did not yet know his name, only that something about him immediately disrupted the quiet structure of my thoughts. He was working behind the register with an ease that made the repetitive motion of scanning items almost look natural, almost artistic. Tall and lean in a way that made him stand out even in a crowded store, with curly hair that seemed slightly untamed, and a face that carried an unexpected softness beneath its structure, a kind of youthful confidence that wasn't arrogance. When his green eyes briefly lifted and met mine as I stood at his counter, I felt something unfamiliar shift inside me. Not loud or dramatic, but subtle and unsettling in the way it made me suddenly aware of myself, of my age, of staring longer than necessary. I quickly looked away, pretending to focus on my groceries while he continued scanning items with calm efficiency. Though his voice broke through my hesitation when he asked politely if I was all right, I realized I had been standing still too long. Lost in a moment I didn't fully understand, and I muttered something awkward in response, trying to recover my composure. But even as I reached for my wallet, I could feel his presence in a way that made the space feel smaller, more personal. As if the ordinary boundary between cashier and customer had somehow blurred without permission. And when he smiled lightly as he handed me my receipt, there was a brief pause, a fraction of a second where his gaze lingered just enough to make my heart react before I turned away and walked out of the store faster than usual, telling myself firmly that it meant nothing, that it was just a passing moment. Yet the problem with moments like that is they do not always stay in their place, because later that night I found myself thinking about him again, replaying small details I hadn't meant to notice, the sound of his voice, the casual way he moved, the way he had looked at me, without judgment or familiarity. And I told myself it was absurd, inappropriate even, to think so much about a stranger, who was likely decades younger than me. Yet the mind does not always follow rules of logic, especially when loneliness has softened its resistance. Over the next days I began noticing how easily excuses formed just to return to that same store, how I would convince myself I needed small things, simply because it gave me a reason to stand in front of his register again. And each time I saw him there was a strange, quiet excitement, building inside me that I didn't fully acknowledge, only felt like a flicker of energy returning to something that had been dormant for too long. Hunter, without ever doing anything deliberate, seemed to carry an ease around him that made conversation natural. Sometimes brief exchanges about the weather or items in my cart, sometimes just a smile exchanged during checkout. But those small moments began to take up more space in my thoughts than I was willing to admit, and I found myself paying attention to details I normally would have ignored, like the way he tilted his head slightly when listening or the way he absent-mindedly ran a hand through his curls. And I began to notice something else too, a subtle awareness in him whenever I approached, as if he recognized me. Not just as another customer, but as someone familiar in an increasingly routine environment. And that recognition alone was enough to make my heart react in ways I had not felt in years, not because anything had happened, but because something was beginning to feel like it might. though I constantly fought the thought, reminding myself of who I was, my age, my life, the boundaries that should exist. Yet emotional logic is rarely as disciplined as rational thought. And despite my resistance, I found myself returning again and again, until even the simplest interaction at the checkout counter became the highlight of my week. And I would leave the store carrying groceries. I barely remembered selecting, my mind still caught in the brief seconds of eye contact or the sound of his voice saying, "Have a good day," which began to feel oddly personal in a way I could not explain. And I told myself repeatedly that it was foolish, that nothing real could come from such fleeting moments, yet the feeling persisted, growing not into certainty, but into curiosity, into emotional tension that I couldn't easily categorize. And on one particular evening, when I had not planned to go out at all, I found myself driving back to Walmart, almost without realizing why I was doing it, as if some part of me had decided without permission. And when I saw him again at the register, something in my chest tightened in a way that felt both unsettling and alive, because he looked different under the store lights, more real somehow, more present, and as I stepped forward with my cart, I could feel the familiar internal conflict rising again. The awareness that I was crossing into emotional territory I had avoided for years, yet also the undeniable pull of wanting to stay in that moment just a little longer than necessary, and when our eyes met this time there was no accidental glance or distracted hesitation, only a brief, quiet recognition that something unspoken existed between awareness and restraint. And even though nothing was said, beyond the usual exchange of items and payment, I left that night with the same feeling I had been trying to avoid from the beginning, that something inside me had started to wake up again, not loudly, not recklessly, but slowly, carefully, and in a way that made even silence feel different when I returned home. Because for the first time in years, loneliness was no longer just emptiness. It had become something mixed with anticipation, something uncertain, something I could neither fully welcome nor completely deny. And that was the beginning of everything changing, even if neither of us had said a single word that should have changed anything at all.